Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our panel, both live and virtually. We really appreciate your attendance. This panel is Monuments, Critical Race Theory, and the Teaching of History. And we have a wonderful group of people here to talk to you about some of these recent developments in history as a discipline, as a subject, as a part of American and world culture. This is the seventh and final event in our Learning from History series this semester. I'd like to thank Dean Chuck Ryback and the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for supporting this conference and inviting us to participate. I'd also like to thank the Departments of History and German and the UWGB libraries for sponsoring the various events in the Learning from History series. While history has sometimes been the subject of public debates, it has become a controversial subject recently. This began about 3 years ago with the publication by the New York Times of the 1619 Project to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of enslaved Africans in the American colonies. The project quickly became controversial, and several state legislatures threatened to defund schools that adopted any of the study materials produced by the project, and then President Trump called for a patriotic history curriculum and announced the creation of the 1776 Commission. The following year, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, widespread Black Lives Matter protests erupted, sometimes descending into violence. In many places, protesters tore down statues and monuments dedicated to Confederate generals or politicians or to those who had engaged in the slave trade. These actions sparked debates over the relationship of historical symbols such as monuments and flags, history, and public memory. More recently, many politicians have voiced criticism of critical race theory. 8 states have passed legislation restricting the teaching of various topics, and another 20, including Wisconsin, have legislation pending. This legislation that has been proposed or passed will have a significant impact on teaching history as it restricts discussion of certain topics such as white supremacy or patriarchy, or calls for alternative, quote unquote, alternative voices to be given equal time in the classroom. Our panel today includes 4 historians who will address various aspects of these controversies in the United States and in Europe. I will introduce the panelists, and each will have 10 minutes to present their topic. We'll hold questions until after each of the panelists have had a chance to give their presentations, but please feel free to put questions in the chat. Paula Ganyard is helping us manage and moderate, and she'll keep track of those questions to bring up at the end of the talk. So our 4 panelists. David Voelker is Professor of Humanities and History at UW Green Bay. He specializes in the history of early America up to the Civil War with a special focus on First Nations and environmental history. He is widely published in history pedagogy. Heidi Sherman, who is joining us virtually via Zoom this morning, is Associate Professor of Humanities and History at UW Green Bay. She studies medieval history and archaeology and is a specialist in Russian history. Mark Karau, also joining us virtually this morning, is Professor of Humanities and History at UW Green Bay. He specializes in 19th and 20th century European and German history, and particularly on the First and Second World Wars and the Holocaust. Julian Jacklin is visiting lecturer in Democracy and Justice Studies and History at UW Green Bay. She specializes in 19th and 20th century American history, and particularly on Wisconsin. She has particular interest in working class and labor history, as well as ethnic and gender studies. And so without further ado, David, if you would like to begin.
Sure, thank you, Clif. And thanks everybody for joining us, whether in person or virtually. The controversies surrounding the 1619 Project, the removal of Confederate monuments, and the alleged role of critical race theory in contemporary education all center on the role of race and racism in American history and in the United States today. The concern, which was initially raised almost exclusively by white conservatives, is that progressives and liberals are distorting history by overemphasizing the significance of slavery and racism, and are harming Americans of all racial groups by unfairly casting white people as oppressors and very much as a secondary concern, casting people of color as victims. One result over the past year and a half or so, as Clif alluded to, has been the creation of some counter projects, counter to the 1619 projects, for example, from the short-lived 1776 project to the 1836 project in the state of Texas, and these are both aimed at promoting patriotism through education. I think even more alarmingly, we have these states that have passed or are in the process of considering legislation purportedly aimed at preventing public schools from teaching certain ideas attributed to critical race theory. And given that our theme here is misinformation and disinformation, you'll notice a lot of my language is pretty carefully problematizing some of these claims. The Wisconsin State Assembly passed Assembly Bill 411 back on September 28th with 60 Republican votes and 0 votes from Democrats. This law did not emerge out of legitimate educational needs or concerns in Wisconsin. It's very similar to the laws passed in many other states as part of a concerted effort to mobilize the Republican base by making education around race and racism a polarizing political issue. So yes, politics is in the on position here as we're talking about these topics. And this is not just my opinion. One of the leading critics of critical race theory, Christopher Ruffo, who's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which is a conservative think tank. And he led a workshop, or was one of the workshop leaders for an ALEC-sponsored event back in December. And he's been very explicit about mobilizing critical race theory or hostility toward critical race theory as a political lever. Some of the words that have been flagged through this legislation, including in Wisconsin, as either wholly or partially violating this potential law, include EDI, which is equity, diversity, and inclusion, equity, patriarchy, marginalized communities, land acknowledgement, racial justice, so social justice, systemic racism, whiteness, and white supremacy. So that's just a partial list. This law would be enforced by allowing anyone to sue a school board if they think that any of these concepts are being taught in the schools. It's deeply disturbing, I think, to have a group of legislators with virtually no racial diversity proclaim that systemic racism doesn't exist, cannot be taught in schools, and can't be part of the professional development of teachers either. I would add as a historian that the idea that racism is systemic, that it's beyond individual bigotry, that it's woven into social, economic, political structures, I think this has been established as a historical fact, and that historians need to be able to engage with this historical reality, both for research and for teaching. We need the study of history, including the analysis of structures and systems of white supremacy, to understand why, in a society that professes to be democratic, we might decide to remove monuments to the leadership and soldiers of the Confederate States of America. Anti-critical race theory lawmakers are attempting to suppress discussion of white supremacy and systemic racism in schools, but it's precisely this history we need to understand. The heyday of Confederate monument building coincides with the heyday of the Jim Crow system of racial segregation and white supremacy. So we have to understand these systems to understand why those monuments even exist and why we might think about taking them down. So quickly here, just to give an example, for several, actually, I think I probably need to skip ahead just a little bit here. We think about the Confederate monuments issue. There was recently the monument to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia was taken down. And some folks claim this is erasing history. But I want to point out that to remove a monument that was erected by wealthy white Virginians to promote the emerging myth of the lost cause, which held that the Civil War and its leaders were virtuous, especially the Confederate leaders, I should say, were virtuous Christian men who fought for a constitutional right. I think my sentence fell apart there, but I think that's why that monument existed. African Americans of the time had little power to stop the monument, though there were 3 Black members of the Richmond City Council who voted against funding it. They were soon to be removed from the city council, from the system altogether, through redistricting. Frederick Douglass, at the time, a formerly enslaved person, said that the newspapers were filled with nauseating flatteries of late Robert E. Lee. So this is just to provide a little historical context for some of the monuments that have been taken down and how history can help us understand and reflect on what kind of monuments we might like to have and how we might want to teach that history. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Heidi, would you like to go next?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to shut off my camera so that you can focus on the presentation, and I will share my screen. I will read, I have text, I have slides that I'm going to read. Let's see. And I'm not sure how to go into presentation mode. I think this might work. Does that, I know it's probably still transitioning. Yikes.
Heidi, put it back in the other mode and just run it from there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my computer froze. Oh gosh. Mark, why don't you go?
Sure.
And then I'll fix this.
So I was going to talk about a similar law to the one that's being proposed in Wisconsin, but one that has actually been passed. And this has taken place in Poland. So Heidi is going to talk about Russia. I was originally going to piggyback on that, but I will skip those comments. In 2015, the Polish people elected a right-wing, fairly authoritarian government, which proceeded in the year 2018 to propose a law that would have criminalized the implication or the stating that the Polish nation was in any way responsible for the Holocaust. This comes from the fact that the Holocaust largely took place on the territory that makes up what is today Poland, that Polish Jews made up roughly half of all of those who were murdered in the Holocaust, and that the Polish people themselves had a very complicated relationship with their Jewish people and with their Nazi German occupiers. It's a very complicated history in which the Poles were seen as subhumans, as Untermensch by the Nazis, were murdered in large numbers themselves by the Nazi occupiers in a German effort to, using their term, behead the Polish nation, which meant the execution of those in leadership positions, from politicians down to local priests, professors, teachers, etc. But at the same time, Poles were in a better position vis-a-vis the Germans than their Polish Jewish neighbors were. And there were Poles who turned in to the Nazis, their Jewish neighbors. There were famous instances, one very famous instance in the town now of Jedwabne, where the Polish population took advantage of the German takeover to murder over 100 of their Jewish neighbors. And at the same time, you had Poles who were helping to rescue Polish Jews. And a large number of Poles have been recognized as what are known as the righteous of the nations, individuals who risked life and limb to save Jews during the Holocaust. It's a very complex history. As I say, we could really only barely touch on it here. The government that came to power in 2015 preferred to eliminate much of the complexity of that history and to focus purely on the positive side of that history, that the Polish people overwhelmingly tried to assist the Jews, and that the Holocaust was both a Polish and a Jewish persecution by the Nazis. To that end, as I started by saying, they tried to pass a criminal law in 2018, which would have made it criminal to attribute to the Polish nation involvement in German crimes. Individual Poles, a few bad apples here and there, acceptable to talk about. But anything that would impute the Polish nation as a whole was to be made illegal. There was an international outcry against this. The law was made a civil law instead of a criminal law. The original thought was to have the penalty be 3 years in prison for those who violated this law, and instead it was passed as a civil law in 2018, where the penalty would be, and this may sound very familiar given what Professor Voelker just said, that you would be allowed to sue anyone who was violating this law. Two professors, in particular, Professor Jan Grabowski from the University of Ottawa, was sued under this law, and judgment was passed earlier this year against him and against one of his collaborators for writing a book that looked at the actions of some Poles in particular counties around Poland during the course of the Holocaust. The book is called Night Without End. And in this book, one of the individuals that was discussed was a mayor of a small town who turned Jews in to the Germans. And one of the descendants of this individual brought a lawsuit. In reality, it was a lawsuit brought by a larger group known as the Institute of National Remembrance, which is a group affiliated with this new Polish government. And the lawsuit was funded by the Polish government. The idea being to force these scholars to pay financial penalties for violating this particular law. In the end, the lawsuit's judgment went against them, but they were not forced to make any financial payment. But it has become a major controversy within the historical community. Professor Grabowski refers to their actions as Holocaust distortion, as efforts not to deny the Holocaust, not to deny that it happened, but to distort the ways in which it happened by whitewashing the involvement of, in this case, Poles who took part, in the case of countries like Ukraine and Romania, to do the same thing for their populace. Basically agreeing that the Holocaust happened, but denying that their people had anything to do with it, aside from maybe a few bad apples here and there. The concern over this law is similar to the one that Professor Voelker has talked about that's being discussed in Wisconsin. If you are liable to be sued for the statements that you make and the study that you pursue as a historian, and you are subject to being labeled something like a historical falsifier, which has happened to Professor Grabowski. The fear is that this is going to shut down historical research, especially amongst younger generations, where people will be steered to less controversial fields. A field like the Holocaust is an inherently controversial one because of, as I mentioned earlier, the very complex history that is the case not only in Poland, but in all of these countries in Eastern Europe, in what Timothy Snyder has labeled the Bloodlands. So the Polish law serves as a model, and maybe directly as a model, given when it was written, for the law that's being discussed in Wisconsin. And the concerns are similar on the part of historians. The chillingness of research into controversial subjects, subjects that especially right-wing governments would prefer not be discussed because they are against patriotic readings of one's history. And with that, I'll turn things over to Professor Sherman.
Oh, thanks a lot, Mark. And I think I've got it figured out. So I will not go into presentation mode. And all right, so you can see everything. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about memory and the Great Patriotic War, which is what World War II is referred to in the Soviet Union and of course today in Russia. And when I say Putin's Russia, I mean, it really is because he has been ruling there for, well, 2 decades, and rule, I'm using it intentionally. And now Putin himself is a historian. Well, I mean, he fancies himself as one, and he particularly does write about history. He's published a couple of little essays on the Russian Federation website, and his essays really focus on the unification of the Slavic peoples, especially Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians. And now he's very interested in history, and he's written these little essays. Now he's also the leader of a institutional program that came through in the Duma and was approved that is really clamping down on the way that people remember the Great Patriotic War. So I'll talk about that a little bit, but one of the things that I really wanted to talk about is how Russia's textbooks, and going into back to the Soviet Union really, how their textbooks have been rewritten, revised regarding memory of the Great Patriotic War, because I think it's a good example. Now, in March 2021, the Ministry of Culture decided to once again revise textbooks for the upcoming academic year. And it was because of something that Putin had said at a press conference. And here's his reaction at the press conference when he looked at the book that all school children, well, high school children in Russia were using. So everybody in the Soviet Union has people who died in the war, of course. The Soviets lost, anywhere from, 25 million to 35 million during the war. It was just devastating. And so you can understand that people have strong feelings about how they memorialize the war. Putin himself, his family was in Leningrad during the siege. He lost his older brother. He is not born yet. He was born right after the war, but here is him laying flowers at the cemetery where Leningraders are buried. And the latest criticism of school books, which inspired revision, was that there was not enough about the Battle of Stalingrad. But I wanted to just talk a bit about, and here you can read ahead, that the Soviet Union and the Russia, I mean, is really a place where textbooks and memorializing the war has always happened. I mean, it always flows with politics. So after the war, during the Soviet period, the interpretation of World War II really focused on the victory of socialism over fascism, but also did not mention the Molotov-Ribbentrop Compact, in which Stalin made a secret treaty with Hitler and they divided up Poland. So that wasn't mentioned in Soviet treatments of the war. Now, what's super interesting, and I think this is something that people know less, is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, of course, there was a lot of freedom in the community. People were very excited to go into the archives and look at their history in a new way. It's almost like Russia, the interpretation of the war in the 1990s was overly Western, right? Because, for example, I think this quote right here, this is by the author of this book right here that I have shown regarding the Eastern Front. Historians, Russian historians who write about the inexhaustible resources of the Soviet Union and the help of the Allies, but notice that they don't mention the participation of the Soviet people. So that's minimized. That was minimized in 1990s post-Soviet Russian treatments of the war. But there were things they started to talk about more openly, which is good, like Stalinist oppression and the Holocaust. Okay, now today things have, the pendulum has kind of swung in the other direction. Soviet memory or memory of the war is much more, I would say, Russian nationalist, and it's also driven by demands of the government, right? So we can see that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement today in textbooks talks about how it contributed to delaying the war for the Soviets, that Stalin needed it in order to get ready for an inevitable war with Hitler. Also Soviet or Russian treatments today in textbooks really highlight the role of France and England in the Munich Accords and not delaying the war. So you get, yeah, so this is, let's see, they give focus to Soviet collaborators like the Ukrainians with the fascists, and Western scholars criticize the Soviets for seizing the Eastern Front, but Russian historians today counter such criticism with the reminder that the Soviets saved millions from a German victory. So this, I think the textbook revision is very important because it shows us the interpretation, how the state would like its young people to learn about the war. So I think that's very important. But I also comes along with a series of legislation that is very dangerous. So in 2021, just over the summer, there were several laws that were passed by the Duma that criminalize any kind of criticism of anyone involved in the Soviet war effort against fascism. So that, of course, extends to Stalin, right? But the justification is we have to really protect the memory of our Soviet war heroes. So don't criticize them, but also don't criticize Stalin. Okay. And now there are jail terms that come with criminalization, and it's 5 years. There have been historians and political activists who have been suppressed within the last several years. And this new legislation is going to complicate things even further. But the thing that's very problematic also is that the archives related to World War II have been closed, and they weren't widely open anyway, but I mean, whoa, now they're really closed. And also human rights activists like Memorial, which works on documenting government-led suppression, like, for example, the Gulag. They have a Gulag museum. Also, they keep an archive of the, millions of people who served in the Gulag. So that organization just last week is actually targeted by the government. And there was a very interesting New York Times article that you can actually read about the persecution of Memorial. And of course, another piece of legislation that went through the Duma this summer was that Putin will be able to serve as the president of Russia through 2036. And yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. I'm not aware of my time, but I am very happy to take questions. And this, yes, so I'll thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Heidi. Jillian, you're our last speaker. Would you like to introduce the video you're going to show?
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to thank everyone, my colleagues in history and Clif in particular, for inviting me to join this panel. So I'm going to be showing a short film clip, but before I do so, I'd like to explain why I am. So I actually grew up here in northeastern Wisconsin, and I attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison through a financial aid program called Fast Track for first-generation low-income college students. And when I started college, I majored in Spanish and international relations, thinking I wanted to work for the American government or perhaps abroad somewhere for the foreign service in Latin America. Yet I found myself taking history classes. And as luck may serve it sometimes, I had the fortune of taking a class with Professor Camille Guerin-Gonzalez called Memory and Place in Chicano and Latino History. And it was truly the first time that I felt like I took a history course where I learned about everyday people and the meanings of landscapes and memorial projects and monuments, and how mapping history through objects and landscapes is as important, right, as the narratives that we read. And often it's through those monuments and landscapes, right, that we learn alternative versions of history, as Dr. Ganyard referred to it last night, right? Sometimes actually maybe what we call conspiracy theories now weren't as criminalized in the past. And that's something that I'd like to talk about. I'm going to show a short film clip. So this is really important. The woman talking in the film, her name is Doria D. Johnson. I had the privilege of attending graduate school with her and having lots of conversations about the importance of family stories and conversations. And both of our research actually stem from the communities within which we come from, and the stories about our local past. So Paula, if you'd be willing to play it for me, I'd love that.
My great-great-grandfather, Anthony Crawford, had an altercation at a store with a white storekeeper about the price of his cottonseed. Grandpa refused to do business with him and was arrested, and then was lynched in a spectacle, ritualistic killing at the town square in Abbeville, South Carolina, 100 years ago.
WCLA, Abbeville, Greenwood, 92.9 FM.
A lot of people don't talk about the lynchings in their family, and some of us do. For those of us who do, we represent a whole slew of people who are so traumatized that they can't speak, that their relatives did not pass down this history to them. So the Crawfords have always felt, I think, an obligation to speak up for Grandpa Crawford. We were all socialized that way.
No more of this. This violence must cease. No more of this. No more hanging. no more of this.
Terrorizing the black community, white mobs lynched more than 4,000 black people. 4,000 black people. 4,000 black people in the South between 1877 and 1950, and more than 180 of them were killed in South Carolina. As you witness the bringing of these vessels of soil for holy consecration, may you declare yourself a repairer of the breach, an instrument of reparatory justice that declares never again we are standing on holy ground.
It was moving to stick our hands in that dirt and to look at actual soil that holds too many people's DNA. I think is a powerful way of symbolizing the history of lynching in the United States.
And if we start telling the truth about our history, we could actually change the climate for freedom in this country. I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism. We're here today because there was terror in this region. Black people were pulled out of their homes. They were burned alive. They were murdered. They were hung. They were beat. They were shot. And that terror has to be acknowledged.
Exactly.
Yes. This landscape is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy. It is a false story. It is an incomplete story. We're changing that today. And we have to change it because something important happened here. 100 years ago, a man named Anthony Crawford, a strong man, a faithful man, but because he insisted on fairness, a lot of people didn't like that he was doing well. They didn't like that he could sell food and cotton to white merchants. And one day when he was being confronted by someone who wanted to buy his product for less than was fair, they actually arrested him because they couldn't allow a proud, strong, prosperous black man to stand up for fairness. And that wasn't enough. A mob of 300 people came to the jail to pull him out. A trial wasn't going to be good enough. And they took this man out of the jail and they actually dragged his body through this community. And then they took him to a spot, and they weren't content to just beat him. They weren't content to just hang him. They shot his body 200 times. When the family, the grieving family whose descendants are here today, just wanted to reclaim their grandfather, the people in control said, no, we're going to let that body hang there for a few days, just as a statement to all the black people in this region. And that family had to flee, and it was an injury. It was a burden. It was an assault. And today we are here to give voice to that hardship. But more than that, we are here to give witness to the importance of what can happen when we come together and say, I'm here. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do to be truth tellers, to be witnesses for justice, is to gather in a place like this and say, I'm here. This marker is a story about hardship. It is a story about bruising and cutting and suffering. But when we get together, when we say we are here, when we join together in truth-telling, we turn those cuts, those bruises, those scars into medals of honor. This is the most honorable place in Abbeville, South Carolina. We are here.
We were banished. We were ordered out of town. To stand there when everybody was gathered, and I could look out in that crowd and think about how many people got in their cars, how many people got on airplanes, to stand at that moment with the Crawford family as we pulled the cover off of history. America is a place where symbols are important, where markers are important.
And that's a beautiful thing.
When you read that text on that marker, it's the truth. And so where he died in an extra legal murder, we have come back with an answer to that that's permanent. That's a permanent marker. If you go do business in City Hall, if you go do business at the courthouse, you walk right past Anthony Crawford. And he's looking back at you.
Thank you, Paula. So I just wanted to follow up with the reality that this is like a very violent story, of course. And I do show this in classes, but I always preface it with, this isn't a story about trying to create guilt amongst students. Rather, it's a story about the complexity of our global history. And I think without the opportunity to be able to talk about things like this, we're going to really silence those unpopular stories, right? And not have that fully complete map of the past that we all hope for. So thank you.
Thank you, Jillian. That was a wonderful video. I want to thank all 4 of our panelists. Those were all really great presentations. We've got some time for conversation. So those of you online, please offer any questions you might have in the chat. We'll be monitoring those. And those of you in the audience, please simply raise your hand if you have questions that you'd like to ask our panelists or have us discuss as a group. And maybe I can get us started. So Professor Karau kind of alluded to this in his presentation of the Polish law that restricts how historians may talk about the past, and Professor Voelker did as well. I'm struck by the similarity in several places in Europe and the United States, and I can also attest in other places around the world too, the similarity in how history is being treated legally, politically, and so forth. And so I'm wondering from all of you, our panelists, what is this significant? Are these striking circumstances that we're seeing around the world about attitudes towards history? Is this significant? What does it tell us about our contemporary situation, the role of history in our contemporary situation? Anyone like to take a stab at that? David, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, I can say a few things about that. It's a big question. It's an important question to Clif. I'm coming at it from a just one historical corner, I guess you could say. But I think that it's important to recognize if we have societies that are claiming to be democratic, aspiring to be democratic, that we have freedom of inquiry and freedom of speech around, and also academic freedom around history, so that there's not some official history that is promulgated by and overseen by a government. So part of this is it's a matter of freedom of thought and speech. And we do certainly see some tendencies in various places in the world to have restrictions on how national histories are depicted. So the 1776 project, which we mentioned, the 1836 project focused on Texas, the stated intention is really to make sure that students are learning a particularly positive history that will instill patriotism. And it sounds like there's something very similar happening in Poland and also in Russia. And I think the film that Jillian showed for us about the Anthony Crawford lynching is really powerful, because you can see there that coming to terms with history as people are understanding it is, it's coming to terms with reality. It's moving beyond some sort of denial. And it can also be very healing. In other words, it can provide a path forward to a society that is more just. I think this topic, I said earlier, like, politics was an on position for me. In other words, I wasn't going to tiptoe around the fact that Here in Wisconsin, it was exclusively Republicans who were trying to control how race is being taught about, how racism is or isn't being taught about in the schools. But here again, my point isn't to say, well, the Democrats should control that. It's more that we should have academic freedom and intellectual freedom and freedom of speech around these topics, rather than some sort of official control over how these things are being taught.
Mark?
Yeah, there has been an upsurge in general around the Western world in the last decade of right-wing authoritarianism, and that has targeted history. We see it specifically in Poland, and I mean, I hate to say it, but I think there's a very strong trend of it in the Republican Party in the United States right now. And we see it in Wisconsin in the law that's being proposed here. And groups along those lines, people who think along those lines, I should say, prefer a history of national, to use a loaded term, exceptionalism, whether it's Polish exceptionalism or American, and don't like the complexity that is reality, and that is the history that we have to try to understand. And the fear, at least on my part, I share Grabowski's, but fear for the younger generation. Retirement's not all that far away for some of us, but there are younger students coming into our field, and are they going to be deterred from asking really critical and really important questions for fear of not being able to land jobs, for fear of being sued by the communities that they do get jobs in? It is a very real worry, I think. I'm deeply concerned about what's happening here. It resembles Poland far too much.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I was struck just now, and also when you gave your presentation earlier, you'd mentioned about how historians might turn to different subjects to escape kind of critical criticism of what they were doing, or indeed legal actions. And I was struck during the Cold War, and Heidi, you probably know more about this than I do, so maybe you can jump in as well. But in Eastern European states, especially those under Soviet domination, many historians simply didn't study the contemporary world because it was so dangerous to do so. And the result of this actually was an outpouring of phenomenal studies of medieval history, but because that was one area they felt they could investigate and write about without too much danger, although I'm sure that there were exceptions to that as well. So I mean, that there could be, I think historians will find ways would find ways to write histories, but I fear, like you do, Mark, that it would negatively impact many areas of historical research. Heidi, would you like to comment?
Yeah, sure. Interestingly, in the Soviet Union, all periods of history were political. And even my area, the Viking Age, was really a dangerous field to study, because if you found something in your archaeological dig that showed beyond a doubt that the Vikings were in Russia, in an area before the Slavs, which could potentially offend Slavic, I don't know, patriotism or something, you were in trouble. So it's just, this has been the political shaping of history is something that's been going on, and well, I mean, all over the world for a long time, but it's become really pronounced and scary lately. And I think I wanted to talk, just mention that I think that the Soviet Union and then Russia is a good example of what could happen with the future if we are not able to teach freely in our schools in the US, because when you think about it, David had mentioned how healing it can be to recognize, acknowledge, and sort through grief, right? Community grief. And in the Soviet Union, they never had that opportunity for the Gulag, for example, which was such a horrible, and the tens of millions of people were in Stalin's prison camps. Many died. And they virtually have no way to grieve because all attempts to grieve are attacked by the state in the last 20 years. So they only had maybe a few years in the post-Soviet period before Putin came, and that was just so turbulent. You can see like that the lack of acknowledgement and community spaces for grief can lead to a deepening of forgetting. And that's definitely happening in Russia.
Thank you, Heidi. Jillian, would you like to comment on that as well?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And I really just appreciate everything that everyone's bringing to this panel. To come back to the beginning of my presentation and the reality as an undergraduate at UW-Madison that my story mattered, that my family had a history that mattered, I think is really kind of where we need to start when we think about educating children and what's important about that reality. Because what Heidi said about grief and healing, and David mentioned as well, is really, really crucial to thinking about talking about things that are unpopular, like systemic racism and patriarchy and homophobia, right? That, like Confederate iconography, litter the landscape of the United States as well as really the globe through a colonial framework. So to not be able to teach students about these realities, unfortunately, I don't think is going to do the kind of justice that people want to create these laws is going to do, right? It's just going to reinforce a criminal justice system that privileges certain people over others, perhaps including people who create ideas, which is really something to think about. Heidi brought up a number of times, the criminalizing of certain types of information, right? And so when my advisor asked the question, why are there not a lot of people of color where you're from, right? We were gonna have to ask that question about why do we not hear about why, right? Why we sit on native land, why there are less African-Americans percentage-wise in Northeastern Wisconsin than other places, right? Without our ability to inquire, right? We're gonna lose that opportunity for the healing of all of that grief.
Thank you, Jillian. We have several questions from the chat, so let me read one or two of those and ask for the panelists to respond. So this first one is from Paul, and he writes, can we push back against restrictions here by discussing situations in Central and South America where leftist regimes have suppressed truth in history? That is, are we becoming like them? Thoughts on that? This is maybe a little bit outside of our panelists' expertise, but can anyone address South America in particular, Central America? Jillian?
That's a really good question. And right, is where the partisan language and the binary between left and right in thinking become overshadowing of the importance of the historical questions that are at hand, right? It's not whether extremists are right-wing or left-wing per se, right? It's about the opportunity for people to be able to bring up alternative narratives that really challenge what David had mentioned, this really, really scary thing called an official history, right? It's like this idea that there's an official language, that there isn't an opportunity for other people to be able to speak. And certainly, right, the United States is highly implicated in regimes all over South and Central America. And that, of course, that's a different panel altogether. But that's a really important question, right? Extremism is problematic in whatever form it takes.
Now, Heidi has talked about the Soviet Union, which of course was a leftist regime. So certainly it's a left and right extreme problem. I can't speak specifically to Central and South America. I just don't have that expertise. But the similarities of right and left in this way are certainly valid to point out.
Heidi, would you like to offer any comments?
Oh, no, I mean, I totally agree with what was just said, and I appreciate that, because I think extremism, and I have to say that what was going on in the post-Soviet 1990s with history was also extreme, but it was the pro-Western view that was looking at the Soviet Union, and these are by Russian historians who were so excited about experimenting and publishing new ideas that they were too Western in their thinking about the war, to the degree that they were overlooking the contributions of the Red Army and the Soviet citizenry in defeating Hitler. So I think that the pendulum swings, and we have to be careful where it lands, and that's where historians and an informed public can intervene and create these spaces for us to kind of step back and say, wait a second, maybe we're going too far, left or right or whatever.
Thank you, Heidi. We have another question from the chat. This is, and I apologize, I may mispronounce your name. This is from Reblin. And it says, I believe it was Professor Karau who mentioned that these laws are turning people away from studying this history. How would the panel suggest that we as young people combat that? How can we ensure our history isn't forgotten as our generations move forward? We've already kind of started to address this, but we could go a little bit more directly to that. David, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. I mean, so, we've been talking about laws passed all across the United States that are seeking to essentially ban certain kinds of concepts and languages, not just from history classrooms, but from the schools altogether, and even from professional development from teachers. So there's a kind of erasure that's happening there. And these are laws. They've been passed in some states. They'll probably be more passed in other states, but the laws can be changed, and I think they have to be changed. If you're in a place where teachers are suffering under this kind of a law that's trying to prevent them from teaching about essential aspects of American history and politics, for example, then of course those teachers need support. Here in Wisconsin, as I said, the state assembly passed their Bill 411 just yesterday. It's my understanding, if I'm reading the legislative history right, it's been advanced to the state Senate's Education Committee. So it's moving forward through a process. There's absolutely no way that our current governor would sign this bill into law, even if it is passed by the legislature. But it's something that's out there that that could be essentially activated at a later point. So I just think that it's important to have discussions about these topics, to be aware of what's going on, and to participate in the political discourse on these topics.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to reiterate something that Professor Karau brought up before, which was, the thinking about the types of history that we talk about and whether or not younger students and scholars are going to be turned away. And as Heidi indicated, right, like all forms of history are political in some way. They're all perspective driven, right, rooted by evidence and right critical analysis. But the reality is that I just graduated from UW-Madison in 2020 with my PhD, And the type of history that I study, labor and working class history, critical race theory, feminist theory, that these things, while talked about, are not necessarily popular, right? Even now. And so to think about less and less people coming out that are able or willing to talk about these systemic realities, how much history will we indeed lose? So to come back to the student's question about what can younger people do, right, is to make your voices heard about the importance of the types of things that you learn about, right? Your university administrations and your teachers and your state legislature are not going to put on the platform what you want unless you say that you want it.
Thank you, Jillian. Mark, Heidi, do either of you have thoughts on this?
I would just echo what Jillian just said, political activism. It's necessary. It's tiring, but it's something that people you have to be involved in. It's the only way to fight these kind of laws is to make sure that you're out there, your voice is being heard, you're voting to put in people who are not going to support laws like this. It's really the only answer.
Yeah, I was just going to say, not much. That, I mean, when we think about history, it sounds like a discipline, but it really is memory. It's our memory. It's our collective memory. And I to frame it in that way, I think helps. I mean, do we really want to lose that in for future generations? I don't think so. So we have to fight that.
Okay, we have another question from the chat. This is from Anne. I have been struck by the focus on the emotional impact of critical race theory on white students, children, or young adults. This seems to be couched as an effect of, quote, liberal brainwashing, unquote. This is baffling to me because liberals are so couched as, quote, snowflakes, unquote, who can't control their emotions. There are so many problems in the ways political factions have shaped not just historical discourse, but emotional discourse and how it should be at the center of curricular choices. Any thoughts on that?
I can just speak to this
David?
briefly, something I cut from my opening presentation. Yeah, so the Assembly Bill 411 said that part of what it was trying to address was the idea that an individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of the individual's race or sex. I mean, it's part of the law that should never happen in schools. And the implication here is that teaching about a history of racism would do that, especially for white students. And I don't think that that's what teachers are trying to do when we teach about race and racism. But it doesn't seem to me inappropriate to feel some sense of anguish or distress when learning about a very troublesome history. Yeah, so I do think it's an interesting reversal of what we might think of as the sort of stereotypical political positions. And I don't think that's accidental. I mean, I do think there's a kind of a strategy here to try to turn some of those stereotypical ideas about liberals or progressives on, to turn it against them. So.
Thanks, David. Anne responded with yes, exclamation point on the reversal point. So good. Jillian, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
I think David covered it, but the importance of collective responsibility is key. We're not all going to feel good all the time, right? Like people who experience slavery don't feel great about that. That doesn't mean that everyone shouldn't have the opportunity to learn about these really difficult things. And as all of us know, life is actually not that easy all of the time, right? And we have to be able to negotiate and think about the systemic realities of things rather than the individual responsibility, right? We are a collective society. What can we do to share that burden?
Mark or Heidi?
I don't have anything.
I don't really have anything on this particular point now.
Okay, good, thank you. So I'd like to come back to Jillian's video presentation just for a moment, and some comments that all of you have made throughout the talk about the importance of place and landscape. And so could we talk a little bit about the importance of monuments, of markers, and so forth? And what are your thoughts on, should statues, monuments be taken down? Should new ones be put up? Can we contextualize them in some way? There's been a lot of debates on this over the past couple of years in the United States, but I could speak to Germany as well, and just thinking about the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe that was built in Berlin at the beginning of the 21st century, and the debates in trying to get that monument built at all as well. So Jillian, maybe I should turn to you first, because you really foregrounded this idea of place and landscape. What are your thoughts on how we, as Heidi put it, how do we remember as a society, as a community, through landscape and monuments?
Well, thank you for the question. And it definitely comes back to thinking about what David said about our collective responsibility to not erase things that have happened, regardless of how they necessarily make us feel on a personal level. But yet, in reality, history, collective memory, as Heidi said, is indeed very personal, right? And so whose personal stories do we want to have shaped the places within which we live? When we saw the cover, right, being torn off of history, as Doria D. Johnson said in the video, with the unveiling of the Anthony Crawford monument, right? Monuments are often the iconography and the symbols of who we are as a society, right? And whoever controls the symbols really controls the story of that society. And so when we think and reflect is, what kind of story do we want to project, right? Do we want to project a story that forgets about the things that we did incorrectly so that we repeat them? Or do we want the monuments and symbols to represent perhaps where we made mistakes so that we can learn from them?
Thank you. Heidi, you also talked about collective memory. Would you like to follow up on some of that?
It's just so interesting to me. Not really sure what I have to contribute, aside from the fact that I think we have them all over, like Green Bay, for example, monuments and statues to the Packers and to other periods of American history. And I think we think those are important because we stop and we take photos with them. But the painful ones, I was just thinking how in the Soviet Union and Russia, the most prominent monuments are ones to victory, right? They're hundreds of feet, titanium, or not titanium, but so they're massive stone things, right? Or metal things. But the monuments that are to grief, like the collective cemeteries, or the monuments to people who died in the Gulag, are low to the ground. They're you saw like Putin putting flowers on a grave. And it seems to me like the monuments for grief could get lost from the view, if that makes any sense. So I kind of do worry that I think it would be important to think about how we reconsider monuments that bring up periods that are difficult for us to think about, not just glorifying a period we feel good about.
Thank you.
I don't think we're particularly good at that. And most societies are not. I think the only one that I can really think of, and it's come up in these talks over this entire semester, that has gotten very good at it are the Germans. And Clif mentioned the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe.
Yep.
There's questions about how effective that is as a memorial. that I've mentioned in other talks, and I'll mention it here, the stumbling stones, the Stolpersteine, which are low to the ground. They're literally stones in the street, in the sidewalks, but they're arresting, and they almost literally do cause you to stumble when you see them. So that's a rare example, I think, of something that is effective, that does that kind of commemoration of something that you need to remember, even though it is not something that makes you feel good at all. So.
Yeah, at first, I just really appreciate the comments from all of my colleagues here. Maybe one thing I would add is, earlier I mentioned erasure, and I could imagine someone saying, yeah, and taking down Robert E. Lee is an erasure. And so I do recognize this is a difficult question, difficult issue. We do need to make distinctions between history and the past on the one hand, and then what we decide to have monuments about. So we don't have monuments about most things. Most of the past, lots of important things we don't have monuments about. So I see monuments as a public choice that should be democratically considered. And just because a monument was placed at one point in history does not mean that it deserves to be there forever. And I think a statue, that literally puts a traitor to the United States on a 30-foot high pedestal in a very prominent place is a good example of that. Like, yeah, maybe we should reconsider that. And I know that reasonable people can disagree about monuments, and I think it is a very good thing that we've been having more public discussions about monuments. I'm pretty ambivalent when I see monuments actually being torn down and defaced, at least sometimes. But often in those cases, it's an act of desperation, that people have been unhappy with monuments that they find to be oppressive, that they see as symbols of white supremacy or of colonialism. And there comes a point where the democratic system has failed. It hasn't served those critics. So they might take matters into their own hands. My preference overwhelmingly is that we have open discussions and use decision-making processes, politically, to decide how to handle monuments. And not just to destroy the monuments, but in those cases, to take them down and to take some time to figure out what to do with them. I mean, maybe they're just going to be warehoused for some time, but maybe they'll be put in a museum where they can be properly contextualized. So there is no way, shape, or form in which I would advocate for erasing the history of the Confederate States of America. It's really about thinking about, what do we want to memorialize publicly? And when we are studying that history, how are we going to do it? Because, having a monument, it is sending a particular kind of message. And again, with those Confederate monuments, they were placed intentionally at a particular point in time by a society that was not democratic, and that was actually, rebuilding white supremacy in the wake of the Civil War and the end of slavery.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I'm struck by your use of the word erasure too, and the idea that taking down monuments might be an erasure. But as you've kind of implied here, I think, David, putting up monuments can also be an erasure, right, of erasing, what actually happened. You mentioned General Lee being a traitor to the United States, let alone fighting in the defense of slave states. And so what we memorialize is important. Okay, we have another question from the chat. This is from Jeff, who writes, I'm stuck on diagnosing the problem. I would argue that using history for political purposes comes from not seeing truth, capitalized, capital T truth, as inherently valuable. Might the underlying problem be a philosophical one where no, quote, knowledge, unquote, is seen to be a value unless it serves some practical purpose, even if that purpose is to make us feel good about ourselves? Isn't that a problem of cultural values? Thoughts?
Oh, yes.
Go ahead, Heidi.
Yeah, I was going to say that I agree with that. It is about cultural values. And what was so interesting to me is that Soviet Union, good or bad, it was built out of a culture that really valued, or out of a people that really valued culture, right? And so the Soviets funded massive archaeological projects, had huge publication runs for, all kinds of history books. It was very, I mean, granted, you had to write a particular way, to a particular political line, but there was a lot of money that was invested in historical culture in the Soviet Union. It's part of that tradition. And maybe that's why we see it so starkly in Putin's Russia today, that it's a big value to Russians still, that we, maybe they want to erase certain uncomfortable histories, but they want to still have history. History is still very important in Russian schools, whereas I would argue that in the US, it's less so because of our culture, which is sobering, isn't it?
Thank you.
There's multiple ways of looking at that, and I think as historians, I mean, we feel differently. We're knowledge is a value regardless of its purpose, and that's why we do the work that we do. For politicians, I think then you're looking to have more of especially for those like the ones in Poland, where you do want a history that you can make use of for political purposes. So it depends on the individual, it depends on the person that you're talking about. But for professional historians, we're not looking to find something that is useful. We're looking to, well, I mean, useful, but not in a political sense, to advance the field, and useful in that way.
Stephen?
No, just really briefly, I mean, as Jillian said earlier, and may want to speak to a little more, I mean, our knowledge, historical knowledge, there's always a political valence with that. I think we are, as historians who do research, but then also teachers, we are committed to the evidence and to our disciplinary practices for collecting evidence and analyzing evidence. And I think that's probably the capital T truth that I mentioned in the chat. Like, there's going to be disagreements about that. Our views may change, but we really are trying to take account of the evidence and make sense of it to tell meaningful stories about the past. And that's our commitment. And again, when I said earlier about politics being in the on position, that was just like, in order to be honest about what's happening right now, I needed to identify, who are the legislators who are responsible for this legislation. That's what I was getting at, not the idea that using history as a political tool is our first priority.
Just to quickly follow up, it's such an important question, and I think one that we as historians have to think about in the way that we often, can use certain types of language, but also how society then reflects language upon exploration of the past. So in my own work, for instance, cultural values, right, are what shape the political landscape in Northeast Wisconsin. Meanwhile, partisan values reformulate what people want in their everyday lives. So it's important, as David indicated, to talk about where certain types of threat to collective knowledge are stemming from, right? But then it's even more important that rather than let political parties or partisan ideologies shape how we understand the past, that we continue to explore and create new types of knowledge and inquiry so that we don't, right, contribute to this loss of a multi-narrative past.
Thank you, Jillian. Unfortunately, we're at a time, which is really unfortunate because Carly's just posted a question about how we teach the Holocaust. And I know a lot of us would really like to respond to that if we had more time. Another time, Carly, we'll definitely get to those topics. So we are at time, unfortunately. I want to thank all of our panelists for agreeing to be on this panel and speaking passionately about history and its role in contemporary society. And I also like to thank all of you in the audience, physically here and online. There were some excellent questions. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching our presentation. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Cliff.
Thanks, everybody.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Paula.
Thanks, Haley and Kathy.